First of all, I want to thank ACT and Imagine BC for inviting me to come here. It's an honor, and I'll try to stick to answering some of those questions and providing some perspective. But importantly for you folks, I think just a real quick overview of the Columbia Basin Trust and what we're doing, not as an organization, but specifically in climate change. The mandate of our organization is to support the communities of our basin and to assist the communities to build their well-being in a number of different areas, social, economic, and environmental. And given that, about 4 or 5 years ago, when we started having dialogues with communities, the climate change issue in the Columbia, which is in the southeast corner of British Columbia, the climate change issue really started to become forefront in a lot of our community dialogues. And folks said, so what does this really mean for us in this region? We've got a lot of information from the IPCC on the international global impacts of climate change. But regionally, what does that mean for us as citizens, as people in our communities? So we embarked on a process with a number of wonderful individuals from the University of British Columbia, Ben Kangsney from the Ministry of Environment, some folks from UBC, University of Washington, to try to get some of the scientists that are involved in all this science and background to provide us with a summary of what the localized impacts might be for our communities. And we created what we call the Big Ugly document. It was about a 110-page technical document, which is a wonderful document. And we boiled it down to a document that we could use with communities to start the dialogue, we called it, on climate change. And there's copies of that document out there. It's a summary document, really easy to read on what are some of the localized impacts of climate change for our communities. The language had to be clear language. We had to make sure that we could communicate some of the more esoteric, some of the higher level language that is used in scientific terms down and make it really meaningful for people, and not only take the climate change from a scientific perspective on temperature change and potential precipitation changes, hydrologic changes, but what does that mean in terms of impacts in our communities, to our river systems, our snow lines, etc. So that's the work that we initially embarked on, and we took that to the communities, and we were all happy after pulling our hair out for a number of, as you can see, for a number of years, and we took it to the communities, and the communities said, well, that's great. They kind of put it to the side and said, so what? What do we do? I mean, they went that quickly to the next step, and this is not just your broad-based community, like general communities. This is our councillors, our mayors, our regional directors. They went, okay, all right, we get it. You know, we get all this. The province is showing great leadership and has shown and said that we need to do this. It's now a mandatory for our OCPs to start doing some of this stuff. We've signed on to the Provincial Climate Change Action Charter. What do we do? And this comes back to the questions earlier on in our earlier panels about, okay, so what does adaptation mean? And that's basically the question they were asking us. What do we do in terms of adaptation? What do we do in the face of all of this? Well, being the organization that we are, we went back to our scientific panel and we said, so, hey folks, what do we do? And everyone was kind of going, well, you do adaptation planning. And the first question was, what's adaptation planning? Does anybody really know what it is? And frankly, the answer that we got from the wonderful people that we worked with was, well, not really. There's a lot of different descriptions, and that's part of what happened today. One of the questions here is what gives you great concern and great hope regarding BC's ability to adapt. There's a lot of really good ideas out there, and there's a lot of good concepts, and there's a lot of really good science. But I think the biggest concern for me is the conversation that we had earlier on today is making all the science and all this so daunting that people can't grasp the simple concepts that are there. I mean, just talk about, I know we need major policy changes in the country and maybe globally, and we're going to have displacement of populations potentially. But when you go down to a community in my region and you start talking about, losing all of our coastal areas and all of this stuff, they just throw their hands up. And that's not what they want to talk about. I mean, it might be a reality, but if you want to engage our people in our basin on these things, what you have to do is you have to bring the language down is one thing, but you have to talk about what it means for them in their localities. And you have to talk about really local, small things. And that's what we started to embark on with our adaptation planning process. So last year, as some of you will know, and there's a young gentleman here, Jeff, put your hand up. We started to work with a couple of communities in the Columbia Basin, just working in Elkford. And if any of you know where Elkford is, it's in the heart of the coal mining center of British Columbia, Elkford and the city of Kimberley, to use them as, I hate to use the word, pilots for a rural community adaptation planning. So we started to get a team of experts with a lot of expertise in climate change, from planning to the climatologists, the meteorologists, throw in a urologist in there, whatever you want. All kinds of ologists were coming in, right? We had them working with them. And we had a team of community extension people, and Jeff's part of that. And we provided some resources to go into these communities and work with them. The way we selected those communities is we said, okay, there's a lot of interest in the basin for adaptation planning, and we put out an RFP, and we asked communities that were ready to respond. Who wants to do this? We had 9 of 23 communities in our basin respond to that RFP, and they had to commit resources, they had to commit political capital, the mayors and the council had to be on board, they had to commit staff time, and most of all, they had to commit to a process in which they would take the outputs of the adaptation planning and integrate it into their own planning processes at a local community. So you got tangible, doable initiatives out of your adaptation planning that you could put into your local planning. So, all the stuff we talked about today, I'm not going to go over the range of things you could do. We can do that later if you want, but that's what we did. So we selected those 2 communities, and we're working with them. So what gives me hope? What gives me hope is we had all of these people that are in the heartland of British Columbia, mayors and councillors, and real rednecks. And I grew up there. They're my neighbors, right? And they bought into this. They didn't balk at it. They didn't get caught up in the science and this graph and that graph and the potential. They didn't. They went through all of that stuff and they said, okay, all right, there's a concern, right? Yes. There's an issue, right? Yes. We have to deal with it, right? Yes. Okay, what are we going to do? And they went down to that step, and we've got those 2 communities, plus those other 7 communities. We had 9 communities respond. They have agreed to create a learning network, so they're observing what's happening in these 2 communities, and we're creating and documenting these adaptation processes. And next year we hope to work with the other communities that have originally applied to start to do this. So go community by community, customize, because the 2 processes we have in Alford is very different than the work we're doing in Kimberley. This comes back to what was said earlier on today. Customization across the board from locality to locality is a necessity because of the cultural changes. Just in my part of the basin, there's cultural changes from east to west, north to south, let alone the province of British Columbia across Canada. There's all kinds of cultural changes. So you're going to have to customize your approach based upon the people that exist in that land base to engage them. Their issues are different and their aspirations. People talked earlier about setting these long-term goals. Each community has their own aspirations and what they want to do, and you have to acknowledge this. And another point that I want to tie into earlier conversations today about adaptation planning, a key thing is, in Elkford, they're doing the adaptation plan along with their official community plan, which is a legislated process that they have to undertake. In Kimberley, they're doing it as a standalone adaptation plan. Well, one of the key learnings we're finding here, there's a number of key learnings, but one of the most important ones is that it's not just about climate change adaptation planning. Earlier, folks mentioned this. It's more about resiliency and sustainability. And if you could wrap up this conversation about climate change with the conversation about development and sustainability, I think you'll have a lot more success at a community level doing this stuff. We're really finding that the conversation is really veering away from the climate change science and more dealing about development issues and sustainability issues in the communities. And I'm probably running over my time anyway. We can talk ad nauseum later if you have questions about it, but we've got that program going on, and also in our basin, this conversation of adaptation versus mitigation came up, because our program was originally just adaptation, and we said, if you want to do some mitigation stuff, that's great, but it's really not the focus. What we found was, like everybody else here said, you can't separate the 2 at the bottom level. Absolutely, it's a given, forget about it. You can't separate the 2. You have to do them simultaneously. So what we're trying to achieve to make up for that lack of foresight when we started this program is we're working with our regional districts and our municipalities to do a comprehensive region-wide mitigation strategy. Mitigation is, don't use the word mitigation, they're calling it an action plan, a climate change action plan. And what they mean by that climate change action plan is reducing their carbon footprint and emissions. And they've signed on to the province's, a number of communities have signed on to the province's Climate Action Charter, and that really launched them off, saying we committed to this, so we're going to have to live up to this. And collectively, a number of them did. So they're getting together 23 municipalities and 3 regional districts and 5 First Nations communities to come together to develop a framework whereby they can go through a systematic process and do climate change mitigation planning. It can happen. Our communities can do it. They understand. Let's not complicate the issue. Let's give them the assistance they require, and we'll start moving forward and dealing with this issue. Thank you very much.